In the frozen isolation of the Polaris 6 Arctic Research and Training Facility, a slight, underestimated systems engineer was about to face a test no obstacle course could prepare her for. What started as a routine winter training program took a shocking turn when she came face-to-face with a full-scale systems collapse in the middle of a killer storm. Leila Tran wasn't your typical recruit. For years, she'd spent her life repairing electronics in her family's shop, known for spotting a fault line in a machine before it became a catastrophe. When she encountered a failing generator and cascading structural instability during the worst blizzard in decades, she had no idea she was stepping into the role of the only person who could keep the station alive. Leila took command in a way that would decide whether anyone saw rescue, and proved that survival in the Arctic depended on brains as much as muscle. What began as a brutal series of failed physical tests would become a battle for the survival of everyone inside Polaris 6. The station would never be the same after the day they learned their toughest fighter was the one who couldn't climb an ice wall. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The transport plane's engine screamed against Arctic winds as Leila Tran pressed her face to the small porthole window. Below, the Polaris 6 Arctic Research and Training Facility appeared as a cluster of interconnected modules, half buried in snowdrifts that shifted like living things. The sprawling station stretched across the ice shelf like the skeleton of some massive creature, its metal bones gleaming dully under the pale winter sun. "First time seeing the ice?" asked the passenger across from her. Leila turned to find a young man with kind eyes and a nervous smile, his dark hair slightly disheveled from the turbulent flight. "Sanjay Patel," he said, extending his hand. "We met briefly at orientation in Vancouver, remember? You're the systems engineer from Seattle." Leila Tran, she shook his hand, grateful for a familiar face. "And yes, first time this far north." "Yep. Same. Though I've been researching Arctic conditions for months. Did you know the ice beneath the station drifts approximately 15 centimeters per day? That's why they built it on modular foundations with flexible coupling systems." Sanjay's nervous chatter continued as the plane banked sharply, fighting crosswinds. "Of course, that assumes the coupling systems are properly maintained, which, according to my research..." The plane touched down hard on the ice runway, bouncing twice before the pilot managed to bring it under control. Through the windows, Leila watched ground crew members emerge from a hangar, their faces hidden behind Arctic masks and goggles. "Welcome to the edge of the world," Sanjay muttered. The cargo door opened with a pneumatic hiss, and Arctic air flooded the cabin like a living thing. Even through her heavy jacket, Leila felt the cold seep into her bones. The wind carried a metallic taste and the distant sound of machinery grinding against the elements. Ground crew members waved them toward the hangar, their movements urgent. As Leila gathered her gear, she caught snippets of conversation over the radio chatter. "Storm system moving faster than predicted. Need to get them inside before the next squall line hits." Inside the hangar, the sudden absence of wind felt almost oppressive. Leila removed her goggles and blinked away tears from the cold, taking in her surroundings. The space was cavernous, filled with snow vehicles, emergency equipment, and supplies stacked to the metal ceiling. Everything bore the weathered look of equipment that had survived multiple Arctic winters.
"Recruits, form up." The voice cut through the hangar like a blade. Captain Elias Rourke emerged from behind a row of snowcats, and Leila's first impression was that he looked like he'd been carved from the same ice that surrounded the base. Tall and broad-shouldered, with steel-gray hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to assess everything in terms of weakness and strength, he moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to absolute authority. Behind him walked a woman in her 40s with sharp features and an observer's gaze. Unlike the others, she wore civilian clothes beneath her Arctic gear and carried a tablet instead of radio equipment. "I am Captain O'Rourke," the commander announced, his voice echoing off the hangar walls. "For the next 6 months, this facility is your world, and I am your god. The Arctic doesn't care about your feelings, your background, or your college degrees. It only cares whether you can survive." His eyes swept across the 12 recruits, lingering momentarily on each face. When his gaze reached Leila, she saw his assessment was complete in seconds. Too small, too soft, probably wouldn't last a month. "Some of you are here because you think disaster response is a noble calling. Others want adventure or excitement. A few of you," his eyes found Leila again, "probably think your technical skills will compensate for physical shortcomings. Let me be clear. When you're hanging from a rope in a blizzard trying to rescue survivors, your laptop won't save you." Sanjay shifted nervously beside her, and Leila noticed several other recruits standing straighter, trying to project confidence they might not feel. "This is Miss Volkova," Rourke indicated, the woman with the tablet. "Government liaison. She's here to evaluate whether this program deserves continued funding. Your performance reflects on all of us." Mila Volkova stepped forward, her accent barely detectable but unmistakably Eastern European. "I will be observing your training and documenting your progress. Please continue as if I am not here." Leila caught the slight emphasis on documenting and wondered what criteria the government was using to measure success. "Now for the tour," Rourke announced. "Stay together, stay alert, and try not to embarrass yourselves." The facility was larger than it had appeared from the air. Rourke led them through a maze of heated corridors connecting laboratories, sleeping quarters, equipment bays, and training areas. The architecture was purely functional. Metal walls, exposed piping, and industrial lighting that cast harsh shadows. Everything hummed with the constant sound of heating systems fighting against the cold. Primary power comes from 3 diesel generators. Backup is wind and solar, though don't expect much from solar in winter. The entire facility can switch to emergency power if needed, but that only gives us 72 hours before systems start failing. Leila noticed the slight vibration in the floor that suggested the generators were working harder than they should be. She also caught the faint smell of diesel exhaust, which shouldn't be detectable in the living areas if the ventilation systems were functioning properly. They visited the communication center, where banks of equipment maintained contact with the outside world, and the medical bay, staffed by a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Amara Kessler. She had the calm competence of someone who had dealt with emergencies in places where help was days away. "The training hangar is where you'll spend most of your time," Rourke said, leading them into a space filled with climbing walls, obstacle courses, and environmental simulation equipment. "We can recreate conditions from tropical storms to Arctic blizzards. You'll experience them all before you're qualified for field deployment." One of the recruits, a tall young man with the build of an athlete, raised his hand. "How realistic are the simulations?" "Tobias Glenn, right? Former extreme sports competitor?" At the young man's nod, Rourke's expression showed the first hint of approval. "The simulations will push you beyond anything you've experienced. Physical fitness, mental toughness, and team coordination are all essential. Those who can't meet the standards don't make it to graduation." Toby grinned confidently, and Leila noticed several other physically impressive recruits exchanging knowing looks. I was beginning to understand that this program had already divided them into categories, those who looked the part and those who would have to prove themselves. The tour ended at the dining facility where hot food and coffee provided welcome relief from the constant cold. As the group dispersed to claim sleeping quarters and organize their gear, Leila found herself standing at a large window overlooking the ice field. The view was simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. Endless white stretched to the horizon, broken only by the dark line where ice met sky. In the distance, she could see the geometric patterns of pressure ridges where ice sheets had collided and pushed upward, creating jagged walls that shifted constantly with wind and tide. "Intimidating, isn't it?" Dr. Kessler appeared beside her, carrying a steaming mug of coffee. "Humbling," Leila replied. "Makes you realize how small human engineering really is compared to natural forces." "Spoken like an engineer," Dr. Amara smiled. "Most people see beauty or danger. You see systems and forces."
Is that a bad thing? Not at all, though you should know that Captain Rourke tends to value more direct approaches to problem solving. Leila studied the doctor's expression. Meaning he doesn't trust people like me? Meaning he's lost team members in the field and believes physical capability is the best predictor of survival. You'll need to prove him wrong, not with arguments, but with results. That evening, as Leila arranged her gear in the small sleeping cubicle that would be home for the next 6 months, she reflected on the day. The facility was impressive but aging, held together by constant maintenance and the expertise of its crew. Captain Rourke was clearly competent, but biased toward a narrow definition of strength. The other recruits seemed capable, though she suspected some were more committed to the mission than others. Through her small window, she could see lights moving across the ice field, maintenance teams checking equipment before the weather turned. The wind had picked up, rattling the facility's metal shell with increasing intensity. Sanjay knocked on her doorframe. "Hey, want to grab some coffee before lights out? I heard tomorrow starts with physical assessments at dawn." "No exceptions," Leila agreed, following him to the dining area. As they walked, she noticed Mila Volkova in the communications center, speaking quietly into a satellite phone. The government observer was clearly reporting to someone, though Leila couldn't hear the conversation. Whatever criteria were being used to evaluate the program, she suspected her own performance would be scrutinized more closely than most. Outside, the wind continued to build, and the facility's metal frame groaned softly under the pressure. Leila filed away the sound along with her other observations. In a place where survival depended on understanding systems and recognizing when something wasn't working properly, every detail mattered. She just hoped Captain Rourke would recognize that truth before it was too late. Dawn at Polaris 6 arrived as a gradual lightening of the endless gray that passed for night during Arctic winter. Leila stood with the other recruits outside the training hangar, her breath forming clouds that the wind immediately tore away. The temperature gauge by the door read -28 degrees Celsius. "Today we separate the wheat from the chaff," Captain Rourke announced, his voice cutting through the wind. He stood before them in standard Arctic gear, apparently unaffected by conditions that had most of the recruits huddled together for warmth. Dr. Kessler emerged from the medical bay carrying a tablet and emergency supplies. "I'll be monitoring everyone's vitals. Anyone showing signs of hypothermia or exhaustion will be pulled from the exercises immediately." "No one gets pulled unless they're unconscious," Rourke corrected sharply. "Learning to push through discomfort is part of the training." Amara's jaw tightened, but she nodded. Leila noticed Mila Volkova positioning herself with a clear view of the training area, tablet ready to document everything. The first test was a sled hauling exercise. Each recruit was assigned a weighted sled containing emergency supplies and tasked with pulling it across an obstacle course that included ice walls, debris fields, simulated by scattered equipment, and a section where they had to navigate around pressure ridges. Toby Glynn went first, attacking the course with the confidence of someone accustomed to physical challenges. His technique was flawless, and he completed his circuit in just under 12 minutes, barely breathing hard at the finish. "That's the standard," Rourke announced. "Anyone taking more than 15 minutes fails this portion." Leila's heart sunk. She'd done her best to prepare physically, but months of desk work and a naturally small frame hadn't given her the strength she was seeing from her competitors. When her turn came, she approached the sled methodically, checking the harness configuration and testing the drag coefficient. "It's not a research project, Tran. Start pulling." The weight hit her immediately. The sled contained at least 60 kilograms of equipment, and the ice provided minimal friction assistance. Leila leaned into the harness, finding a rhythm that would conserve energy over the long haul. Around her, she could hear other recruits cheering for their favorites, but the sound seemed distant. The first obstacle was a low wall that required hauling the sled up and over. Leila tried twice before managing to get enough momentum to clear it, precious seconds ticking away. Her shoulders already burned from the strain. The debris field was worse. The sled caught on every piece of scattered equipment, requiring constant course corrections. She watched Toby complete his second circuit while she was still halfway through her first. "Come on, Tran! Put your back into it!" She was putting everything into it. The problem was that everything she had wasn't enough for this particular challenge. By the time she reached the pressure ridge section, her legs were shaking from exhaustion, and her lungs felt like they were full of ice crystals. The final section required pulling the sled up a steep incline designed to simulate hauling supplies up from a rescue zone. Leila made it halfway before her legs gave out entirely. She collapsed to her knees, gasping, the harness still cutting into her shoulders. "Time," Rourke called. 18 minutes, 43 seconds. Fail." Leila unstrapped herself from the harness and stumbled to the side, where Dr. Kessler was waiting with a thermal blanket and a concerned expression. "Drink this," Amara said, pressing a cup of hot electrolyte solution into her hands. "You're showing early signs of exhaustion hypothermia." "I'm fine," Leila managed between gasps. "You're stubborn," Amara corrected. "There's a difference." As the morning progressed, the tests became increasingly brutal. Ice wall climbing with full gear. Wind resistance runs where industrial fans blasted Arctic air at the recruits while they navigated obstacle courses. Cold water survival drills in a pool maintained at just above freezing. Leila failed every single one. The ice wall was particularly humiliating. While Toby scaled it like a spider, finding handholds that seemed impossible to reach, Leila struggled to make it halfway up before her grip strength gave out. She fell twice, saved from injury only by the safety harnesses that Dr. Kessler had insisted on over Rourke's objections. During the wind resistance run, she was blown sideways 3 times, once hard enough to send her tumbling into a barrier. The cold water survival drill was the worst. She made it only 30 seconds before uncontrollable shivering forced Dr. Kessler to pull her out. "Maybe they make float devices for brains," Toby joked as Leila wrapped herself in towels by the pool. Several other recruits laughed, though she noticed Sanjay looking uncomfortable with the mockery. "At least I'm not compensating for something," Leila replied through chattering teeth. Toby's grin widened. "Hey, I respect the attitude, but attitude doesn't keep you from drowning." As the recruits broke for lunch, Leila found herself sitting alone at a corner table, mechanically eating soup that tasted like cardboard. She could feel eyes on her from around the dining facility, some sympathetic, others dismissive. At the instructor's table, she heard Captain Rourke speaking to Mila Volkova. "Brains don't keep you alive when the ice gives way under you. I've seen brilliant people die because they couldn't handle the physical demands. Academic credentials mean nothing out there." Mila nodded thoughtfully. "What about problem solving under pressure? Surely that has value." "Problem solving is what the team leader does. Everyone else needs to follow orders and execute physically demanding tasks. Tran might make a fine consultant, but she doesn't belong in the field." Dr. Kessler appeared at Leila's table, setting down her own tray with more force than necessary. "Don't listen to him," she said quietly. "Hard not to when he's probably right. I knew I wasn't the strongest person here, but I thought I could at least be competitive." "Competitive at what? Pulling sleds? Climbing walls? These tests measure one type of capability, not the only type that matters. But they're the type that Captain Rourke values." His bias? He lost 3 team members in Greenland 2 years ago. Experienced Arctic rescue specialists, all in peak physical condition. They died because they followed protocol instead of adapting to changing conditions. Ever since then, he's been convinced that physical capability is the only reliable predictor of survival. Leila absorbed this information, filing it away with her other observations about the facility's leadership dynamics. That afternoon brought individual assessments, where each recruit demonstrated specific skills like rope work, equipment maintenance, and emergency first aid. These were areas where Leila's methodical approach served her better. She couldn't match Toby's speed, but her knot work was precise and her equipment checks were thorough. During the first aid simulation, she was paired with a recruit who had injured his leg and needed to be stabilized for transport. While other teams focused on speed, Leila took time to properly assess circulation and ensure the splint wouldn't cause additional damage during movement. Time management, Tran, Rourke called. In a real emergency, fast treatment is often better than perfect treatment. In a real emergency, treatment that causes additional injury is worse than no treatment, she replied, continuing her methodical work. She heard Toby snort with amusement. More philosophy from the professor. But when the simulation ended and the medical assessments were reviewed, Dr. Kessler announced that Leila's patient was the only one who would have avoided complications from improper splinting technique. Interesting, Mila Volkova said, making a note on her tablet. The day ended with a briefing in the main conference room, where Captain Rourke reviewed everyone's performance. Names were called out with scores and rankings. Toby Glenn topped the list in every category. Leila Tran occupied the bottom position across the board. Physical training will continue daily, Rourke announced. Those who don't show significant improvement will be removed from the program, no exceptions. As the recruits dispersed, Leila gathered her gear slowly, fighting off waves of exhaustion and disappointment. She'd known the physical demands would be challenging, but she hadn't anticipated the complete, systematic failure she'd experienced. Sanjay waited for her by the door. "Hey, want to grab some coffee? I have some ideas about improving training efficiency." "Thanks, but I think I just need some sleep." "Leila," his voice was gentle but insistent. "Today was just one day. You showed something out there that most of the others didn't." "What? Complete incompetence?" "Persistence. Every time you failed, you got back up and tried again. Toby's good at this stuff, but I didn't see him face any real adversity. You did, and you kept going." Despite her exhaustion, Leila found herself smiling slightly. "Thanks for the pep talk." "Not a pep talk, just observation," Sanjay grinned. "Besides, I suspect tomorrow's challenges might favor different skill sets." As Leila made her way to her quarters, she passed the communication center where Mila Volkova was again speaking quietly into a satellite phone. Through the partly open door, she caught a few words. Initial assessment, diverse capabilities, recommend continued observation. In her room, Leila sat on her narrow bed and reviewed the day's events. Physical failure, yes, but not complete failure. She'd learned something about each test, identified areas where technique could compensate for raw strength, and most importantly, she'd survived. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. She could either spend the evening dwelling on today's failures or preparing for whatever came next. Outside her window, the wind continued building, and she could see maintenance crews checking equipment tie-downs. The Arctic never rested, and neither could she. The morning of the third day brought a different kind of challenge. Instead of gathering at the training hangar, the recruits were directed to the equipment bay where 12 disabled snow rovers sat in various states of mechanical failure. Captain Rourke stood before the lineup of broken vehicles, his expression unreadable. "Real disaster response isn't just about physical capability," he announced. "It's about problem-solving under pressure with limited resources." Leila felt a spark of cautious optimism. This was closer to her area of expertise. "Each rover has multiple system failures," Rourke continued. "Your task is to get your assigned vehicle operational using only the tools in your individual kit. You have 2 hours. Failure to complete the task means you're eliminated from field deployment consideration." Dr. Kessler approached with a medical kit and tablet. "I'll be monitoring everyone for signs of cold exposure. The bay isn't heated, so pace yourselves." Mila Volkova positioned herself where she could observe all 12 workstations, her tablet ready to document the proceedings. The rovers were a mix of older models, each roughly the size of a small car with tracks instead of wheels. They were designed for Arctic transport and rescue operations, which meant they needed to be reliable in extreme conditions while carrying heavy loads. Leila was assigned Rover 7, a machine that looked like it had seen considerable service.
She opened her toolkit and began a systematic assessment, checking obvious failure points first: fuel system, electrical connections, engine components, and drive mechanisms. Around her, other recruits were taking different approaches. Toby dove directly into his engine compartment, attacking the problem with characteristic confidence. Several others followed his lead, assuming engine trouble was the primary issue. Sanjay, working at the station next to her, caught his eye and gestured at his rover's electrical panel. "No power to ignition." "Check your battery terminals," she replied, then returned to her methodical inspection. Her rover's engine turned over but wouldn't start. Fuel was reaching the carburetor, electrical connections appeared sound, and compression seemed normal. The issue had to be more subtle. "Having trouble, Tran?" Toby called from across the bay. His rover was already rumbling to life.
Black exhaust smoke dissipating in the cold air. "Try checking if it's turned on." Several recruits laughed, but Leila ignored the comment. She'd learned to tune out distractions during her years working in her family's repair shop, where impatient customers often hovered while she diagnosed problems. Methodically, she worked through the ignition system, checking spark plug gaps and timing. Everything appeared normal, but the engine still wouldn't start. She was missing something fundamental. "1 hour remaining," Rourke announced. Around the bay, progress was mixed. 3 rovers were running, including Toby's and 2 others operated by recruits with mechanical backgrounds. Several more were making encouraging sounds, but hadn't achieved full operation. Sanjay was struggling with what appeared to be a wiring issue. Leila knelt beside her rover's engine compartment and closed her eyes, listening to the sounds it made when she turned the key. The starter engaged properly, fuel pump was working, electrical systems had power. But something in the engine's rhythm was wrong. She opened her eyes and looked at the air intake system. Arctic conditions meant these vehicles dealt with extreme temperature variations, which could cause condensation and ice formation in unexpected places. Following the intake ducting, she found her answer: a small ice blockage in a sensor line that was confusing the engine's computer about air density. Working quickly, she disconnected the line and used a small heating element from her toolkit to clear the ice blockage. It was the kind of problem that could only occur in extreme cold conditions, and it wouldn't show up on most diagnostic procedures. With the blockage cleared, her rover started on the first try. "Excellent work, Tran. What was the issue?" "Frozen moisture in the mass airflow sensor line. The engine computer was getting incorrect readings about air density, so it couldn't calculate proper fuel mixture." Across the bay, she noticed Mila Volkova making detailed notes. 30 minutes remaining," Rourke announced. Leila looked around and saw Sanjay still struggling with his electrical problem. His rover had power to most systems, but something was preventing proper ignition timing. "Need help?" she asked, wiping her hands on a rag. "I can't figure out the wiring," Sanjay admitted. "There's power everywhere it should be, but the timing is all wrong." Leila examined his rover's electrical panel and quickly identified the issue. "Ground fault," she said, tracing a wire that disappeared into the vehicle's frame. "Probably corrosion in the connection where the timing sensor grounds to the chassis." Working together, they located the corroded connection and cleaned it with sandpaper from her toolkit. Sanjay's rover started immediately. "How did you know to check that?" he asked. "My family runs an electronics repair shop. Ground faults are everywhere in equipment that operates in harsh environments. Salt air, moisture, temperature cycling, they all cause corrosion in electrical connections." 15 minutes, Rourke called. By the end of the exercise, 8 of the 12 rovers were operational. Leila and Sanjay had both succeeded, along with Toby and 5 others. 4 recruits,
all of whom had focused exclusively on engine problems, had failed to identify their vehicle's actual issues. During the debrief, Captain Rourke reviewed each approach methodically. When he reached Leila Station, his expression remained neutral. Tran identified a cold-weather-specific failure that 3 others missed entirely, he announced. However, she also took longer than optimal to reach the solution. "With respect, sir," Leila said, "diagnostic speed depends on problem complexity. A systematic approach prevents misdiagnosis that could waste more time or cause additional damage. In disaster response, time is lives. Fast solutions save people. Perfect solutions don't matter if everyone's dead. Flawed solutions that create additional problems can kill more people than they save." I heard Toby mutter, "Here we go with the philosophy again." But Mila Volkova was watching the exchange with obvious interest, making rapid notes on her tablet. Furthermore, Rourke continued, Tran abandoned her own assignment to assist another recruit. In the field, mission focus is essential. "She helped me complete the exercise," Sanjay interjected. "Teamwork should be valued, not criticized. Individual competency comes first. You can't help others if you can't handle your own responsibilities." Dr. Kessler cleared her throat. "Actually, Captain, helping team members is a core principle of disaster response. No one operates in isolation during emergency situations." An uncomfortable silence stretched across the bay. Leila could sense the tension between different leadership philosophies, with her caught in the middle. Mila Volkova stepped forward. "Miss Tran, could you explain your diagnostic process in more detail? I'm particularly interested in how you identified the sensor line issue." For the next 10 minutes, Leila walked through her systematic approach to mechanical troubleshooting, explaining how different failure modes could produce similar symptoms and why environmental conditions had to be considered in equipment diagnosis. "Interesting," Mila said when the explanation concluded. "Your methodology accounts for operational context, not just component function. Equipment doesn't fail in isolation. It fails in relation to its environment and usage patterns. Understanding those relationships is essential for effective repair." After the debrief, as recruits cleaned their tools and prepared for afternoon training, Dr. Kessler approached Leila privately.
"Well done today," she said quietly. "You showed capabilities that weren't evident in yesterday's physical tests." Captain Rourke didn't seem impressed. Captain Rourke has a narrow definition of success, but you might have noticed that our government observer was very interested in your approach. Leila glanced toward where Mila Volkova was speaking with several recruits, asking detailed questions about their problem-solving methods. What's she really evaluating? Program effectiveness. The government wants to know if we're training people who can handle real-world disaster response, not just pass physical fitness tests. Amara lowered her voice. "Between you and me, there's been criticism that our current approach produces athletes instead of problem solvers." That afternoon's training returned to physical challenges, and Leila's performance was predictably poor. But something had changed in the dynamic among the recruits. Several who had witnessed her mechanical work approached her with questions about equipment maintenance and troubleshooting. Even Toby, while still dismissive of her physical capabilities, seemed to regard her technical skills with grudging respect. "I still think you need to work on fitness," he said during a break between exercises, "but I'll admit, you know your way around machinery." "Thanks for the qualified endorsement," Leila replied dryly. "Hey, I'm just being honest. In the field, you need both kinds of skills." As evening approached and the recruits prepared for dinner, Leila noticed Mila Volkova in the communications center again, speaking animatedly into her satellite phone. Through the partly open door, she heard fragments. "Diverse skill sets, traditional metrics may be insufficient. Recommend expanded evaluation criteria."
The government observer was clearly documenting something beyond simple physical performance rankings. Whether that would help Leila remain in the program remained to be seen, but it suggested that her approach to problem-solving was being valued by someone in authority. That night, as Arctic winds howled around the facility and rattled the metal walls, Leila reviewed the day's events. She had proven herself capable in one domain while continuing to struggle in others. The question was whether technical competence could compensate for physical limitations in Captain Rourke's assessment. Outside her window, she could see maintenance crews checking equipment in preparation for an approaching storm system. Weather reports indicated severe conditions developing, which would test everyone's capabilities soon enough. As she prepared for sleep, Leila reflected on Dr. Kessler's words about diverse skill sets and problem-solving under pressure. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and she was beginning to understand that surviving the program required more than meeting Captain Rourke's physical standards. It required proving that intelligence, adaptability, and systematic thinking were equally valuable when lives hung in the balance. The approaching storm might provide exactly that opportunity. The weather reports had been concerning for 3 days, but the morning of the 4th day brought genuinely alarming news. Meteorologist Sarah Chen's voice crackled over the facility's intercom system as she delivered the update from the communications center. All personnel, this is Weather Central. The low-pressure system approaching from the northwest has intensified beyond our initial projections. We're now tracking sustained winds of 65 kilometers per hour with gusts up to 90. Temperature is dropping to minus 42 degrees Celsius. Storm duration is estimated at 18 to 24 hours, beginning approximately 1400 hours today. Leila looked up from her breakfast, catching Sanjay's concerned expression across the dining table. Around them, conversations had stopped as everyone absorbed the implications. Captain Rourke's voice followed immediately. All training exercises are suspended. We're implementing storm lockdown protocols effective immediately. Department heads report to the command center in 15 minutes. As recruits began clearing their breakfast trays with an unusual haste, Dr. Kessler approached Leila's table. I could use assistance with medical supply inventory and emergency preparations. Interested in helping? Of course, Leila replied, recognizing both the practical need and the opportunity to contribute something beyond her failed physical performances. The medical bay became a hub of controlled activity as Dr. Kessler directed preparations for potential injuries and cold weather emergencies. Leila found herself checking equipment calibration and ensuring backup power systems for critical medical devices were functional. The portable heaters in Storage Room C need to be tested and distributed, Amara said, consulting a checklist. If we lose primary heating, they'll be essential for maintaining livable temperatures in the sleeping quarters. Leila made her way through the facility's corridors, noting details that had become familiar over the past few days. The constant vibration from the primary generators seemed more pronounced, and she caught the faint smell of diesel exhaust again, stronger than it should be if the ventilation systems were operating at full efficiency. Find something interesting?
Leila turned to see Mila Volkova standing in the doorway, tablet in hand as usual. Voltage irregularities, Leila replied, holding up her meter. Probably not dangerous, but it suggests the electrical system is under more strain than it should be. Should that be reported? I'm planning to mention it to Captain Rourke, though I doubt he'll consider it a priority with the storm approaching. Mila made a note on her tablet. What would cause such irregularities? Several possibilities: overloaded circuits, aging transformers, poor connections somewhere in the distribution system. In a facility this old, operating in these conditions, electrical problems are almost inevitable without aggressive preventative maintenance. As if summoned by their conversation, Captain Rourke appeared in the corridor, moving with the brisk efficiency that characterized his pre-emergency preparations. Miss Volkova, I need you in the command center for the final briefing, he said, then noticed Leila. Tran, what's your status on heater distribution? Sir, I've tested all units and they're functional, but I've identified voltage fluctuations in the electrical system that might indicate… Engineering paranoia, Rourke interrupted. The electrical systems have been functioning for 8 years without major problems. Focus on your assigned tasks. Sir, with respect, prevented identification of potential failures could waste time we don't have, Rourke said sharply. The storm will be here in 3 hours. I need portable heaters distributed, not theoretical problem analysis. Mila observed the exchange with obvious interest, making rapid notes as Leila reluctantly nodded acknowledgement. After Rourke departed, Mila lingered. You seemed quite certain about the electrical concerns. I am certain. The question is whether anyone will listen before those concerns become actual problems. By noon, Polaris 6 had transformed into a fortress preparing for siege. External equipment was secured, emergency supplies were distributed, and all non-essential systems were powered down to reduce electrical load. The facility's metal structure began to sing with increasing wind, and the temperature continued dropping. Leila completed her assigned tasks, but found herself drawn back to the auxiliary power bay, where the backup generators stood ready to activate if needed. Her earlier voltage readings had bothered her, and she wanted to understand what was causing the fluctuations. The auxiliary bay was located in the facility's oldest section, where original construction from the 1990s showed signs of decades of Arctic wear. She traced power distribution lines, checking connections, and measuring loads at various points in the system. What she found was troubling. The main power distribution panels showed clear signs of overheating in several circuits. Insulation on older wiring was cracked and brittle. Most concerning, the automatic transfer switch that would activate backup power in an emergency had corrosion on its main contacts. This could be a serious problem, she muttered, making detailed notes about each issue. Talking to yourself now? She turned to find Toby Glenn in the doorway, carrying emergency supplies to the adjacent storage room. Documenting potential electrical failures. The electrical systems in this facility are in worse shape than anyone realizes. You sure about that? Rourke says they've been reliable for years. Past performance doesn't guarantee future reliability, especially when you can see physical deterioration in critical components. Toby approached the distribution panel, studying the areas she had identified. I don't see anything obviously broken. That's because you don't know what to look for. See this discoloration around the contact points? That's heat damage from poor electrical connections. And this corrosion on the transfer switch. In an emergency, this could prevent backup power from activating properly. For the first time since arriving at the facility, Toby saw Leila looking genuinely concerned about something outside his area of expertise. So what do you think we should do? Report it to Captain Rourke and recommend immediate preventative maintenance before the storm hits. After he just told you to stop worrying about theoretical problems? Leila considered this. Rourke had made his position clear, and pushing the issue would likely be seen as insubordination, but the potential consequences of electrical failure during a severe storm could be catastrophic. Sometimes theoretical problems become very real problems at the worst possible moment, she said finally. She found Captain Rourke in the command center, studying weather updates with intense focus. The latest reports showed the storm intensifying even beyond the morning's projections. Sir, I need to report significant concerns about the electrical systems. Rourke looked up from his displays with obvious irritation. Tran, I thought I made myself clear about… Sir, I've identified specific failure points that could cause complete power loss during the storm. The automatic transfer switch has serious corrosion, and there's evidence of overheating in critical circuits. The electrical systems are regularly maintained by qualified technicians. When was the last comprehensive inspection of the power distribution systems? Rourke paused, consulting his records. Scheduled maintenance was completed 6 months ago.
Scheduled maintenance typically covers routine items like filter changes and lubrication. When was the last detailed electrical inspection? The pause was longer this time. I don't have that information immediately available.
Sir, I strongly recommend we address these issues before the storm arrives. If we lose power during peak conditions— Tran. Rourke's voice carried a warning tone. You are a trainee, not a facility engineer. Your job is to follow instructions, not second-guess 8 years of successful operations. Around the command center, other personnel continued their preparations, but Leila could sense their attention on the conversation. Sir, successful operations depend on identifying problems before they become failures. What I'm seeing suggests— What you're seeing, Rourke interrupted, is the result of looking for problems where none exist. This facility has weathered dozens of storms without power failures. Your concerns are noted and dismissed. Leila felt the familiar frustration of being right, but powerless to act on that knowledge. Sir, if those systems fail during the storm— That's enough, Tran. Return to your assigned duties. As she left the command center, Leila noticed Mila Volkova following her into the corridor. Miss Tran, could I ask you to document your electrical concerns in writing for my report? Of course, but Captain Rourke has made his position clear. Captain Rourke's position is noted. I'm interested in alternative perspectives on facility preparedness. That afternoon, as the first winds began battering the facility's exterior, Leila prepared her detailed report on the electrical system issues. She included photographs, voltage measurements, and her assessment of potential failure modes. It felt like completing an academic exercise that no one would read, but thoroughness was her nature. By 1600 hours, the storm had arrived in full force. Wind howled around the facility's structure with a sound like a living thing trying to tear the buildings apart. Snow began accumulating against windows, and the facility's heating systems worked harder to maintain comfortable temperatures. Leila sat in the common area with other recruits, playing cards and trying to maintain normalcy while the Arctic raged outside. But her attention kept drifting to the lights, which seemed to flicker occasionally, and the subtle changes in the facility's background noise. You're doing it again. Doing what? Listening to the building like it's trying to tell you something.
Can you fix the primary generator? Sanjay asked, joining her at the control panel. Leila examined the damage. The fuel line rupture had triggered multiple safety shutdowns, but the real problem was electrical. The fire had damaged the control wiring, and several critical components showed heat damage. Not quickly enough, she said, and not without replacement parts we don't have. From across the bay, she heard Toby yelping in pain. He was holding his right hand against his chest, his face pale with shock. What happened? Dr. Kessler called, still working on Captain Rourke's injuries. Tried to check the fuel shutoff valve, Toby gasped. Metal was superheated. Burned my fingers pretty badly. Leila felt the situation crystallizing around her with terrible clarity. The facility's leader was injured and semi-incapacitated. Their strongest physical performer was wounded. The backup power systems were failing under excessive load, and they were isolated in the middle of a storm that wouldn't allow rescue for hours. Dr. Kessler, she said, how long before Captain Rourke can resume command? He needs immediate medical attention and several hours of rest minimum, possible concussion along with the leg injury. And Toby's hand? Second-degree burns. He'll need constant medical attention and can't use that hand for any manual tasks. Leila looked around the generator bay at the other recruits, seeing uncertainty and growing panic in their faces. The facility's normal leadership structure had collapsed in minutes, leaving them adrift in a crisis none of their training had prepared them for. Sanjay, can you help me assess the backup generators? Together they worked through the status panels, documenting which systems were still functional and which were approaching failure. The news was uniformly bad. Generator 2 is overheating. Coolant levels are dropping faster than they should, Sanjay reported. Generator 3 has bearing problems in the main drive shaft. It's vibrating excessively and making sounds that suggest imminent failure. Mila Volkova appeared in the doorway, looking remarkably calm despite the chaos around her. Status report? Primary power is completely offline. Backup power is failing under excessive load. Captain Rourke and Toby Glenn are both injured and require medical attention. We have maybe 4 hours before complete power failure, less if the remaining generators fail catastrophically. What are our options? Leila realized that Mila was asking her specifically, not the group in general. The government observer was treating her as the de facto leader in the absence of formal authority. We need to reduce electrical load immediately, reroute power to essential systems only, and attempt repairs on at least one primary generator. We also need to prepare for the possibility of total power failure. That sounds like a comprehensive plan. What do you need? The question hung in the air. What did she need? Authority to make decisions that could affect everyone's survival? Trust from people who had watched her fail every physical test? Cooperation from recruits who had barely taken her seriously before this moment? I need everyone to follow instructions without argument, and I need to know that we're all committed to getting through this together. Around the generator bay, she saw nods of agreement, some reluctant but all genuine. Sanjay, you're with me on power system repairs and load balancing. Mila, can you coordinate rationing of food and water in case we're isolated longer than expected? Everyone else, I need you to help Dr. Kessler set up a warmer medical station and gather emergency supplies. As the group dispersed to their assignments, Leila found herself alone with the failing generators and the enormous responsibility of keeping everyone alive until rescue could arrive. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the facility, and she could hear new sounds in the building structure. Groans and creaks that suggested the worst was still ahead. The electrical systems she had warned about were failing exactly as she had predicted, but being right provided no satisfaction when lives hung in the balance. By 0200 hours, Polaris 6 had been transformed into a survival outpost. Emergency lighting cast everything in red shadows, and the temperature in non-essential areas had dropped to just above freezing as Leila redirected power to critical systems. In the main conference room, now serving as a command center, she stood before a whiteboard covered with diagrams and priority lists. The other recruits were arranged around the table, some still looking uncomfortable with the inverted hierarchy that put the program's worst physical performer in charge of their survival. "A status report," she announced, consulting her handwritten notes. "We've successfully reduced facility power load by 60% by shutting down non-essential systems. The remaining backup generators are operating within acceptable parameters, but we're still vulnerable to cascading failures." Sanjay raised his hand. "The power rerouting is holding steady. I've isolated the damaged sections and established bypass circuits for critical systems." "Good. Mila, what's our supply situation?" The government observer consulted her notes. "Food and water are adequate for 5 days at current consumption rates. However, if heating efficiency drops further, we'll need to increase caloric intake to maintain body temperature." Leila nodded. "Dr. Kessler, medical status?"
Captain Rourke has a confirmed concussion and hairline fracture in his left tibia. He's conscious, but needs rest. Toby's burns are responding to treatment, but he can't perform manual tasks with his dominant hand. From his position at the table, supported by crutches Dr. Kessler had improvised from equipment pieces, Captain Rourke shifted uncomfortably. "Tran," he said, his voice hoarse from pain medication, "I appreciate your initiative in organizing response efforts. However, I remain in command of this facility." An uncomfortable silence filled the room. Leila could see the other recruits exchanging glances, caught between respect for formal authority and recognition of practical necessity. "Sir," she said carefully, "you need to focus on recovery. I'm just coordinating maintenance activities until you're ready to resume full duties." Maintenance activities that include making command decisions about resource allocation and personnel assignments? The challenge was direct and unavoidable.
Leila looked around the table, seeing uncertainty in some faces and quiet support in others. Mila Volkova cleared her throat. Captain Rourke, with respect, the current situation requires immediate technical decisions that may be outside your area of expertise. Ms. Tran has demonstrated competence in systems analysis and crisis management. She's a trainee, Rourke replied firmly. This facility has established command protocols, which assume normal operational conditions, Mila interrupted. Current conditions are anything but normal. Toby Glenn, cradling his bandaged hand, spoke up unexpectedly. I don't like taking orders from someone who can't climb an ice wall, he said, and Leila felt her heart sink. Then he continued, but I like freezing to death in the dark even less. Leila's plans are working. The generators are stable, we're warm, and everyone's alive. Maybe we should let her keep doing whatever she's doing. Other recruits around the table nodded agreement, some reluctantly, but all genuinely. Captain Rourke studied the faces around him, clearly recognizing that formal authority meant nothing if everyone chose to follow someone else's leadership. Very well, he said finally. Continue with your coordination efforts, but I expect regular briefings on all decisions. Of course, sir, Leila replied, feeling relief mixed with the weight of responsibility. As the meeting broke up and recruits dispersed to their assigned tasks, Dr. Kessler approached Leila privately. That was well handled, but you should know that command under crisis conditions is different from technical problem solving. People get scared, frustrated, and sometimes irrational. Any advice? Trust your instincts, but listen to everyone, and remember that keeping morale up is as important as keeping the lights on. The next few hours passed in a blur of systematic problem solving. Leila established rotating shifts for monitoring critical systems, organized teams for equipment repairs, and created backup plans for various failure scenarios. Her approach was methodical and comprehensive, treating the crisis like a complex engineering problem with human variables. But the human variables proved more challenging than the technical ones. This is ridiculous, she heard one of the recruits muttering to another. We're taking orders from someone who couldn't even finish the ice wall climb. You have a better idea? Because I don't see anyone else keeping us alive right now. Similar conversations echoed throughout the facility as some recruits struggled with the reversed hierarchy. Leila tried to address concerns through competent action rather than argument, but she could feel underlying tensions that threatened group cohesion. The test came during the morning shift change when the heating system in the sleeping quarters began showing irregularities. The temperature was dropping steadily, and 2 of the portable heaters had failed completely. We need to concentrate everyone in the main common area, Leila announced during an emergency briefing. Body heat and shared resources will be more efficient than trying to heat the entire facility. Absolutely not, said Marcus Webb, one of the recruits who had been most vocal in questioning her authority. I'm not sleeping in a pile with everyone else because our self-appointed leader can't fix the heating. The heating system has multiple cascade failures, Leila explained patiently. Concentrating in one area isn't ideal, but it's the most energy-efficient approach given our power limitations. Maybe if you hadn't shut down half the facility's systems, we wouldn't have this problem. If I hadn't shut down those systems, we would have lost all power 6 hours ago. The argument was escalating, and Leila could see other recruits taking sides. Group cohesion was fracturing under stress, exactly what Dr. Kessler had warned her about. Mila Volkova stepped forward before the situation deteriorated further. Mr. Webb, are you volunteering to take responsibility for facility management? I'm just saying that maybe someone with actual leadership experience should be making these decisions. Such as whom? Mila's voice carried quiet authority. Captain Rourke is medically unfit for duty. You've shown no technical competence with the systems we depend on for survival. Ms. Tran has demonstrated competence in systems analysis and crisis management. What qualifications do you offer?
Marcus looked around the room for support and found mostly uncomfortable silence. I'm not questioning her technical skills, he said finally, but leadership requires more than engineering knowledge. You're right, Leila agreed, surprising him. Leadership requires trust, communication, and the ability to make difficult decisions that serve the group's survival. I'm doing my best to provide those things. If you have constructive suggestions, I'm happy to hear them. The offer diffused the confrontation by acknowledging his concerns while maintaining her position. Marcus nodded grudgingly and returned to his assigned tasks. But as the day wore on, new challenges tested both the facility's systems and the group's cohesion. The storm showed no signs of abating. Communication with the outside world remained impossible, and stress was affecting everyone's judgment and patience. Most concerning were the sounds coming from beneath the facility, subtle changes in the background noise that suggested new problems were developing. Leila tried to investigate, but with limited personnel and constant demands on her attention, comprehensive system monitoring was becoming impossible. When the structural integrity alarms began sounding that evening, she realized their troubles were just beginning. The alarm was unlike anything Leila had heard before, a low, pulsing tone that seemed to vibrate through the facility's metal frame. She found herself running toward the control center before her conscious mind had processed what the sound meant. In the communications center, Sarah Chen was frantically checking sensor readings while Mila Volkova looked over her shoulder at the data displays. "What's the alarm?" Leila called as she arrived. "Structural integrity sensors in Section C are showing movement," Sarah replied, her voice tight with concern. "The ice beneath that module is shifting." Leila felt her stomach drop. Section C housed the primary laboratory facilities and part of the sleeping quarters. If the ice underneath was becoming unstable, they could lose a significant portion of the facility. "How much movement?" she asked, moving to examine the sensor readings. "Lateral displacement of 8 centimeters in the past hour with acceleration. The ice sheet is cracking." On the display screen, Leila could see a schematic of the facility with Section C highlighted in red. Stress indicators showed the module's foundation supports were experiencing forces beyond their design specifications. "Can we evacuate that section?" Mila asked. "In this storm?" Sarah shook her head. "Even moving between modules is dangerous. The connecting tunnels to Section C aren't rated for emergency evacuation in extreme weather." Leila studied the sensor data, trying to understand the forces involved. The facility was built on modular foundations that could accommodate some ice movement, but the storm was creating conditions beyond the original design parameters. The problem isn't just ice cracking, she realized. The storm is creating pressure ridges. The ice sheets are being forced against each other, and Section C is sitting right on the stress line. "Can we move the module?" Mila asked. "Not in these conditions, but we might be able to redistribute the load to reduce stress on the foundation supports." Leila was already formulating a plan as she spoke, drawing on her understanding of structural engineering and load distribution. The facility's modular design included adjustment mechanisms for exactly this type of situation, but they'd never been used under emergency conditions. "I need to survey the affected area and calculate load redistribution options," she announced. "Sanjay, can you help me map the structural stress patterns?" "In this weather?" He looked at her with concern. "The tunnels to Section C are exposed to external conditions. If they fail while we're inside?" "If Section C collapses, we lose a third of our habitable space and most of our laboratory equipment. That includes medical supplies and emergency gear we might need if this crisis continues." Captain Rourke appeared in the doorway, moving slowly on his improvised crutches. "Tran, what's the situation?" She briefed him quickly on the ice movement and her proposed response. His expression remained neutral as she outlined the risks and potential solutions. "You're talking about manual adjustment of foundation supports in subarctic conditions during a blizzard? That's extremely dangerous. More dangerous than losing Section C entirely?" "The structural damage might be manageable. We could seal the compromised module and relocate its functions to other areas." "Sir, the sensor data suggests accelerating failure. If Section C collapses catastrophically, it could damage connecting structures and compromise the entire facility's integrity." Rourke studied the display screens, clearly weighing the options. "What exactly are you proposing?" Leila moved to the whiteboard and began sketching her plan. Section C is supported by 6 adjustable foundation pillars. By raising pillars 2, 4, and 6, while slightly lowering pillars 1, 3, and 5, we can redistribute the load and reduce stress on the cracking ice.
How do you adjust foundation pillars during a blizzard? The adjustment mechanisms are accessible from maintenance tunnels beneath each support point. It's manual work, but it doesn't require external exposure. And if the ice fails while people are working underneath? Leila paused, acknowledging the risk honestly. Then we lose whoever's doing the work. But if we do nothing, we lose the entire module and possibly compromise the rest of the facility. The room fell silent, except for the continuing alarm and the sound of wind battering the facility's exterior. Toby Glenn spoke up from where he'd been listening. I can't do manual work with this hand, but I understand structural engineering. I could guide the adjustment process from the control center. I can handle the physical work, Sanjay added, if Leila calculates the precise adjustments needed. Mila Volkova consulted her tablet. What's the timeline for this operation? 2 hours for calculations and preparation, another 2 hours for implementation, Leila estimated. But we need to start soon. The ice movement is accelerating. Captain Rourke looked around the room at the faces of the people under his command. This is a significant risk based on theoretical calculations. If you're wrong about the load redistribution, sir, if I'm wrong, we'll know quickly and can evacuate the adjustment crew. If we do nothing and Section C fails catastrophically, we might not have time to evacuate anyone. Another long silence, broken by the continuing structural alarm continuing its ominous pulse. Proceed with your plan, Rourke said finally, but I want constant communication with the adjustment crew and immediate abort if conditions deteriorate. The next 2 hours were a blur of calculations, planning, and preparation. Leila worked with structural diagrams and load tables, calculating the precise adjustments needed for each foundation pillar. Sanjay prepared tools and safety equipment for the underground work. Toby, despite his injured hand, took charge of coordinating communication between the control center and the work crew. The maintenance tunnels beneath Section C were cramped, cold, and filled with the sound of ice moving under enormous pressure. As Leila and Sanjay crawled through the access ways, they could hear groaning sounds from the facility structure above them. This is definitely not covered in the training manual, Sanjay muttered as they reached the first adjustment point. The foundation pillars were massive hydraulic assemblies designed to support the facility's weight while accommodating ice movement. Each could be adjusted manually using a mechanical jack system, but the work required precise coordination to avoid creating new stress points. Control Center, this is adjustment crew. Beginning work on Pillar 2, raising by 6 centimeters as calculated. Copy that, Toby's voice replied through static. Structural sensors show continuing movement in the ice, but no acceleration in the past 20 minutes. The work was physically demanding and mentally exhausting. Each adjustment had to be made gradually, with constant monitoring of stress indicators and structural response. Leila found herself drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed, motivated by the knowledge that everyone's survival depended on getting the calculations right. Pillar 4 adjustment complete, she reported, after an hour of careful work. Moving to final positions. Leila, Toby's voice carried urgency. The ice movement is changing. The pressure ridge is shifting direction, creating new stress patterns. She paused, considering the implications. If the ice movement is changing, her original calculations might no longer be valid. Can you give me real-time stress data while we work? Affirmative. But you need to know that Section C is now experiencing stress from multiple directions. The situation is becoming more complex. More complex, but not necessarily worse. Leila realized that the shifting ice might actually provide opportunities to stabilize the facility if she could adapt her approach in real time. Sanjay, change of plans. We're going to make continuous micro-adjustments based on real-time sensor feedback instead of fixed calculations. Can we do that safely? We're about to find out. The final hour of work was the most challenging of Leila's life. Instead of following predetermined adjustments, she was responding dynamically to changing conditions, making judgment calls based on incomplete information while working in cramped, dangerous conditions. But gradually, the structural alarms began to change. The urgent pulsing tone shifted to a less frequent warning signal, then finally stopped entirely. Control Center, this is Adjustment Crew. All foundation adjustments complete. What's our structural status? Section C is showing stable readings, Toby replied, and he could hear relief in his voice. Ice movement is stabilized, and stress indicators are within acceptable ranges. As they made their way back through the maintenance tunnels, Sanjay looked at me with something approaching awe. How did you know that would work? I didn't, I replied honestly. I just knew that doing nothing definitely wouldn't work. Above them, the facility was secure for the moment. But outside, the storm continued raging, and she knew their trials were far from over. The crisis began subtly, with people complaining of headaches and fatigue that seemed excessive, even given their circumstances. Leila noticed it first during the morning briefing, when Sanjay struggled to complete sentences and several recruits appeared drowsy despite adequate rest. CO2 levels, she realized with growing alarm, checking the atmospheric monitors in the control center. The readings confirmed her suspicions. Carbon dioxide was accumulating to dangerous levels throughout the facility. The ventilation systems must have failed when we lost primary power, she announced to the assembled group. We've been running on backup power for 36 hours with sealed buildings and no air circulation. Dr. Kessler immediately began checking vital signs on the most affected individuals. Elevated heart rates, mild confusion, and respiratory distress. We're looking at carbon dioxide poisoning if this continues. Captain Rourke, still moving slowly on his crutches, studied the atmospheric readings. How long before it becomes critical? At current accumulation rates, we have maybe 6 hours before CO2 levels become life-threatening, Leila calculated. Less if people start losing consciousness and breathing becomes depressed. The facility's ventilation system was complex, designed to maintain air quality while minimizing heat loss in extreme conditions. With primary power offline, the circulation fans had stopped, and natural air exchange was insufficient for 12 people in a sealed environment. Can we restart the ventilation fans on backup power? Mila asked. Not without overloading the generators. We'd lose life support systems to gain air circulation. That's not a sustainable trade-off. So what are our options? Leila was already formulating a plan, drawing on her knowledge of atmospheric chemistry and improvised engineering. We need to create CO2 scrubbers using available materials. I can build filtration systems that remove carbon dioxide from the air without requiring significant power. How? Sanjay asked, his voice slightly slurred from the early effects of CO2 buildup. Activated carbon from the laboratory labs combined with sodium hydroxide from the cleaning supplies. We can create chemical absorption systems that pull CO2 out of the air and convert it to less harmful compounds. The work required precise chemistry and creative engineering. Leila found herself working with laboratory equipment, cleaning chemicals, and salvaged materials to construct makeshift atmospheric processors. Each system had to be calibrated for maximum efficiency while using minimal power. As she worked, the effects of carbon dioxide poisoning became more apparent in herself and others. Her hands began to tremble slightly, making precise work more difficult. Her thinking felt sluggish, and she had to double-check calculations that should have been routine. Leila, Dr. Kessler approached with obvious concern. You're showing advanced symptoms of CO2 exposure. You need to rest. Can't rest, Leila replied, continuing to assemble the filtration components. Everyone's depending on getting these systems operational. If you collapse from overexposure, everyone's in worse shape than if you pace yourself. But Leila could see the urgency in the faces around her. 2 recruits were already showing signs of serious impairment, and the atmospheric monitors indicated steadily worsening conditions. Toby Glenn appeared at her workstation, awkwardly manipulating tools with his injured hand. "Tell me what to do," he said simply. "I thought you didn't like taking orders from someone who couldn't climb ice walls."
Right now, I don't care if you can't climb out of bed. You're the only one who knows how to fix this." Working together, they assembled 3 CO2 scrubbing systems and positioned them strategically throughout the facility. Each unit was crude but functional, using chemical absorption to remove carbon dioxide from the air and convert it to harmless sodium carbonate. The systems worked, but slowly. Over the course of several hours, atmospheric monitors showed gradual improvement in air quality. People began thinking more clearly, and the immediate crisis passed. But the effort had taken a significant toll on Leila. By evening, she was operating on pure determination. Her body pushed beyond its normal limits by stress, exhaustion, and chemical exposure. "You need medical attention," Dr. Kessler insisted, checking her vital signs. "Your blood oxygen is low, and you're showing signs of severe fatigue." "I'm fine," Leila replied, automatically, though she wasn't sure that was true. "You're not fine. You're running on adrenaline and stubbornness. That's not sustainable." As if to emphasize the point, Leila felt herself swaying slightly as she stood. The room seemed to shift around her, and she realized Dr. Kessler was right. Maybe I could use a few hours of rest. But rest would have to wait. The storm was finally showing signs of weakening, and new challenges were emerging as temperatures continued dropping outside. Dawn of the 3rd day brought an eerie stillness as the storm finally began to abate. Through the facility's windows, Leila could see the aftermath. Snowdrifts that reached halfway up some structures, and ice formations that had transformed the landscape into something alien and beautiful.
But the improved weather brought new problems. With the storm's cloud cover dissipating, radiative cooling sent external temperatures plummeting to -48 degrees Celsius. Inside the facility, even with their careful power management, temperatures were dropping steadily. "Heating fuel reserves are critically low," Sarah Chen reported during the morning briefing. "At current consumption rates, we have perhaps 12 hours of heating remaining." Captain Rourke studied the fuel consumption data with obvious concern. "What about the auxiliary fuel tanks?" "There's a reserve tank approximately 50 meters from the main facility," Leila replied, consulting the facility schematics. "But it's located outside the heated perimeter, and the fuel lines froze during the storm. We'd need to manually transport fuel using portable containers." "In these temperatures?" Dr. Kessler shook her head. "Exposure time would be measured in minutes before frostbite becomes a serious risk." Leila examined the weather data and facility layouts, calculating distances and exposure times. A team of 3 people could reach the tank, transfer fuel, and return in approximately 45 minutes. That's within survivable exposure limits with proper equipment. "Assuming the fuel isn't frozen solid," Toby pointed out. "Diesel fuel has a freezing point well below current temperatures. The tank is insulated and partially buried, so the fuel should still be liquid." Mila Volkova looked up from her tablet. Who would comprise this team? The question hung in the air. Everyone understood that this was potentially the most dangerous mission yet attempted. External conditions were lethal, equipment failure could be fatal, and success or failure would determine whether everyone survived until rescue arrived. "I'll lead the team," Leila said finally. "I know the facility layout and the fuel transfer procedures." "Absolutely not," Captain Rourke replied immediately. "You're exhausted from the CO2 crisis, and this is a physically demanding operation." "Sir, with respect, physical demands are secondary to technical knowledge on this mission. If something goes wrong with the fuel transfer or equipment, understanding the systems could mean the difference between success and catastrophic failure." "I'll go with her," Toby volunteered, surprising everyone. "My hand is healing, and I can handle the physical work while she manages the technical aspects." "And I can provide backup and emergency assistance," Sanjay added. 3 people reduces individual risk through redundancy." Captain Rourke looked around the room, clearly struggling with the decision. His instincts favored sending the most physically capable people, but the mission's technical requirements argued for Leila's inclusion. "This is extremely dangerous. If conditions deteriorate or equipment fails..." "Sir," Leila interrupted gently. "If we don't get that fuel, everyone in this facility will be dead within 24 hours. The risk is unavoidable." Preparations took 2 hours, with every detailed plan to minimize exposure time and maximize safety margins. The team would wear full Arctic survival gear, carry emergency heating supplies, and maintain constant radio contact with the facility. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Kessler performed final medical checks. "Remember, the cold will affect your judgment and coordination. Move slowly, think carefully, and abort the mission if anyone shows signs of severe hypothermia." The exterior doors opened to reveal a landscape transformed by the storm. Snow had been sculpted into fantastic shapes by the wind, and the facility's external equipment was barely visible beneath accumulations of ice and snow. The cold was immediate and brutal, penetrating every layer of clothing and making breathing painful. Leila felt her exposed skin stinging within seconds, and her breath formed clouds that instantly froze and fell to the ground. "Stay together," she called through the radio, her voice muffled by face protection. "Direct route to the tank, no deviations." The 50-meter journey felt like kilometers. The snow was waist-deep in places, requiring exhausting effort to push through. Ice formations created treacherous footing, and wind-blown snow reduced visibility to a few meters. But they reached the auxiliary tank, a cylindrical structure partially buried in snowdrifts. Leila used a portable heater to warm the access valves, while Sanjay cleared snow from around the fuel connection points. "Fuel is liquid," she reported with relief, testing the tank's contents. "Beginning transfer operations." The fuel transfer required precise coordination. Toby operated the manual pump while Leila managed the flow controls and Sanjay monitored for leaks or equipment failures. Each container held 20 liters, and they needed to fill 6 containers for a meaningful fuel supply. 15 minutes elapsed, Sanjay reported, his voice tight with cold. "How much more?" 4 containers completed, 2 remaining, but were still within acceptable exposure time. The final containers took longer as their hands became numb and coordination deteriorated. By the time they finished, all 3 team members were showing serious cold exposure. "Mission complete," Leila radioed to the facility, returning with 6 containers of fuel. The return journey was a nightmare of exhaustion and numbing cold. The fuel containers were heavy, the snow seemed deeper, and everyone was operating at the edge of hypothermic collapse.
But they made it. The facility doors opened to welcome warmth and immediate medical attention from Dr. Kessler. The fuel they'd retrieved would extend heating for another 2 days, enough time for rescue operations to reach them. Captain Rourke was waiting in the entryway, supporting himself on his crutches. As Leila passed him, he reached out to stop her. "That was exceptional work," he said quietly. "All of you." For the first time since arriving at Polaris 6, Leila heard genuine respect in his voice. "Thank you, sir. Just doing what needed to be done." "No," Rourke replied. "You did what I couldn't do, what none of us could have done without your leadership." In the distance, they could hear the faint sound of helicopter rotors approaching through the clear Arctic air. Rescue was finally at hand. The rescue helicopters appeared as dark specks against the brilliant blue Arctic sky, their rotor noise growing steadily louder as they approached Polaris 6. Leila stood at the facility's main window, watching the aircraft navigate between ice ridges and equipment installations to reach the cleared landing area. 3 days of crisis had felt like 3 weeks, and the sight of outside help brought a wave of relief so intense she had to steady herself against the window frame. "Medical evacuation team is on the ground," Sarah Chen announced from the communications center. "They're requesting immediate status reports on all personnel." The next hour was a blur of medical examinations, equipment checks, and official debriefings. The rescue team included paramedics, technical specialists, and a government official who immediately began coordinating with Mila Volkova. Dr. Kessler supervised medical evaluations for everyone, paying particular attention to Captain Rourke's injuries and the effects of carbon dioxide exposure on the group. "Everyone will recover completely," she announced after completing her assessments.
No permanent damage from any of the emergency conditions. As the most seriously injured, Captain Rourke and Toby Glynn were prepared for immediate medical evacuation, but Rourke requested a few minutes before departure to address the group that had survived under his command. "I owe all of you an apology," he said, standing with the aid of his crutches in the facility's main gathering area. "My leadership philosophy emphasized physical capability above other qualities, and that bias nearly cost lives." He looked directly at Leila. "Miss Tran, you saved this facility and everyone in it through technical expertise, clear thinking under pressure, and leadership I failed to recognize. I was wrong about what constitutes capability in disaster response." "Sir, we all contributed according to our strengths. That's what teams do." "No," Rourke replied. "You did what I couldn't do, what none of us could have done without your leadership." In the distance, they could hear the faint sound of helicopter rotors approaching through the clear Arctic air. Rescue was finally at hand. The rescue helicopters appeared as dark specks against the brilliant blue Arctic sky, their rotor noise growing steadily louder as they approached Polaris 6. Leila stood at the facility's main window, watching the aircraft navigate between ice ridges and equipment installations to reach the cleared landing area. 3 days of crisis had felt like 3 weeks, and the sight of outside help brought a wave of relief so intense she had to steady herself against the window frame. "Medical evacuation team is on the ground," Sarah Chen announced from the communications center. "They're requesting immediate status reports on all personnel." The next hour was a blur of medical examinations, equipment checks, and official debriefings. The rescue team included paramedics, technical specialists, and a government official who immediately began coordinating with Mila Volkova. Dr. Kessler supervised medical evaluations for everyone, paying particular attention to Captain Rourke's injuries and the effects of carbon dioxide exposure on the group. "Everyone will recover completely," she announced after completing her assessments. "No permanent damage from any of the emergency conditions." As the most seriously injured, Captain Rourke and Toby Glynn were prepared for immediate medical evacuation, but Rourke requested a few minutes before departure to address the group that had survived under his command. "I owe all of you an apology," he said, standing with the aid of his crutches in the facility's main gathering area. "My leadership philosophy emphasized physical capability above other qualities, and that bias nearly cost lives." He looked directly at Leila. "Miss Tran, you saved this facility and everyone in it through technical expertise, clear thinking under pressure, and leadership I failed to recognize. I was wrong about what constitutes capability in disaster response." "Sir, we all contributed according to our strengths. That's what teams do." "No," Rourke replied. "You did what I couldn't do, what none of us could have done without your leadership." The government evacuation coordinator, a woman in her 50s with the bearing of someone accustomed to complex emergency situations, approached Mila Volkova with obvious urgency. "Miss Volkova, I need your preliminary assessment immediately. The program's funding review is scheduled for next week, and recent events will clearly influence the evaluation." Mila consulted her ever-present tablet, scrolling through detailed notes accumulated over days of careful observation. "My assessment is that traditional physical fitness metrics provide an incomplete picture of disaster response capability. Ms. Tran's performance demonstrates that technical expertise, analytical thinking, and adaptive leadership are equally critical for mission success." She paused, looking around at the facility that had been saved through improvised engineering and creative problem-solving. "I'll be recommending significant changes to recruitment criteria and training protocols. This program's future effectiveness depends on valuing diverse capabilities rather than narrow physical standards." The evacuation coordinator made rapid notes. "What specific recommendations?" "Integrated assessment approaches that evaluate technical competence, crisis decision-making, and team leadership alongside physical capability. The goal should be building teams with complementary strengths rather than homogeneous athletic ability." As the formal debriefings concluded and evacuation preparations continued, Toby Glynn approached Leila with his uninjured hand extended. "I owe you an apology too," he said. "I thought physical strength was what mattered most out here. Turns out I was wrong about a lot of things. You stepped up when it counted. That's what I'll remember. Maybe when I get back,
you could help me understand some of the technical stuff. I realize I've got gaps in my knowledge that could be important. I'd be happy to, and maybe you could help me improve my ice wall climbing technique. Toby grinned. Deal. The final surprise came as Leila was gathering her personal equipment for evacuation. The government coordinator approached with what appeared to be official documentation. Ms. Tran, I have an offer to discuss with you. Based on Ms. Volkova's recommendations and the events of the past 3 days, we'd like to consider a permanent position with the Arctic Disaster Response Program.
As a trainee? As a senior systems specialist and emergency operations coordinator, you'd help redesign training protocols and serve as technical leadership for future crisis situations. Leila looked around the facility that had been her home, testing ground, and proving ground for nearly a week. The offer represented recognition she'd never expected, an opportunity she'd hardly dared imagine. "I'm interested," she said finally, "but I'd want to complete the full training program first. There are still physical skills I need to develop, and I want to understand every aspect of the work." "Agreed. Consider it a working interview that you've already passed." As the helicopters prepared for departure, Leila found herself at the same window where she'd watched the storm approach days earlier. The Arctic landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful and hostile and utterly indifferent to human ambition. But she'd learned something important in this place. True capability wasn't about meeting narrow standards or fitting predetermined definitions of strength. It was about responding with courage, resourcefulness, and clarity when lives hung in the balance. The helicopter lifted off, carrying them away from Polaris 6 toward the south and civilization. But Leila knew she'd be returning to the Arctic, better prepared and ready for whatever challenges awaited. Below them, the ice continued its eternal dance, creating and destroying, testing everything that dared to exist in its domain. And somewhere in that vast white expanse, she'd found herself. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.